1964. Somewhere in a Ford engineering lab in Dearborn. A group of men are standing around a dyno that is screaming so loud they can barely hear each other talk. The needle keeps climbing past numbers nobody expected. 500 horsepower. 550. Past 600. One engineer looks at another and says something that would turn out to be prophetic. He says, "They're never going to let us race this thing." He was right. Ford was about to build one of the most powerful engines in American automotive history, an engine so dominant, so terrifyingly capable, that the sport it was built for banned it before it ever turned a single competitive lap. Ford built a monster, and then Ford had to bury it. This is the story of the Ford 427 SOHC, the engine they called the Cammer. The engine that was too good to race. To understand why Ford built something this extreme, you have to go back to what was happening on NASCAR ovals in the early 1960s, because this story does not start with Ford, it starts with Chrysler. In 1964, Chrysler unleashed the second-generation Hemi engine into NASCAR competition, and it was not close. Richard Petty, driving a Plymouth with a 426 Hemi under the hood, won the Daytona 500 by more than a full lap. A full lap. In a 500-mile race, that kind of margin does not happen by accident. It happens because one manufacturer has built an engine so far ahead of everyone else that the competition might as well not be there. Chrysler's Hemi swept the top 3 finishing positions at Daytona that year. Ford, the company that had spent years building its brand around performance and racing success, watched its cars get lapped on national television. In Dearborn, that was not just embarrassing, it was an emergency. Here's what you need to understand about Detroit in this era. Racing success was not a hobby or a marketing afterthought. It was the entire business model for performance cars. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday was not a slogan, it was a strategy backed by real sales numbers. When a manufacturer dominated NASCAR, showroom traffic followed within days. Ford's executives watched Chrysler's Hemi humiliate them at Daytona, and they understood immediately what was at stake. If Chrysler owned NASCAR, Chrysler was going to own the performance car market. Ford could not let that stand. So Ford's engineers were given an order that had almost no limits attached to it. Build something that beats the Hemi. Whatever it takes, however extreme it has to be, just build it, and build it fast. What Ford's engineers came up with was not a modification, it was closer to a complete reinvention. They took the existing 427 cubic inch FE engine block, an engine that was already powerful and already proven, and they threw out the entire top end. Gone was the conventional pushrod valve train that had powered American V8s for decades. In its place, Ford's engineers designed something that had never been seriously attempted in a mass-production American engine before. A single overhead camshaft for each cylinder bank, driven by a chain nearly 3 feet long, actuating the valves directly with far less reciprocating mass and far higher potential engine speed than any pushrod design could achieve. This was, in engineering terms, closer to a race car engine or even an aircraft engine philosophy than anything sitting in a Ford showroom. The engineers gave it hemispherical combustion chambers, similar in principle to what made Chrysler's engines so effective, but paired with the overhead cam architecture that allowed the engine to breathe and rev in a way the Hemi simply could not match. They called it the SOHC 427. Everyone else started calling it the Cammer, and the nickname stuck, because there was nothing else on American roads that worked quite like it. The numbers this engine produced were staggering for the era. In its highest state of tune, running dual 4-barrel carburetors, the Cammer was rated at 616 horsepower. 616 horsepower in 1964. From a naturally aspirated engine intended for a full-size stock car. Some independent dyno results during development suggested the real number, under the right conditions, was even higher than the official rating, which itself was almost certainly conservative, because manufacturers in this era routinely underrated their most powerful engines to avoid drawing too much attention from insurance companies and regulators. The chain-driven overhead cam design let the engine rev cleanly to RPM levels that would have destroyed a conventional pushrod valve train through valve float and lifter failure. Ford's engineers had built an engine that did not just match the Hemi on paper, and on the dyno, it beat it comfortably. This was not a marginal improvement. This was Ford solving the problem so thoroughly that they created a new one for themselves, because now they had an engine too powerful to ignore and too radical to simply slide quietly into a race car. Before we go further, understand something important, because this is the part most people get wrong when they hear this story for the first time. This was not some minor engineering upgrade buried in a parts catalog. This was Ford's engineers being handed something close to a blank check and an open deadline, and choosing to build the most radical engine architecture the company had ever attempted under enormous internal pressure in a matter of months rather than years. Prototype Cammer engines were being bolted into test mules and run on dynos around the clock. Engineers were pulling long nights trying to solve problems nobody at Ford had ever solved before. Timing chain harmonics at extreme RPM, oiling system behavior under sustained high load, valve train geometry that had no direct precedent inside the company's own engineering history. Every single one of those problems had to be solved correctly, and solved fast, because Chrysler was not standing still either. This was a genuine engineering sprint, executed under the kind of pressure that either breaks a team or produces something remarkable. In the Cammer's case, it produced something remarkable, and if you think the story stops there, with Ford simply building a great engine and racing it happily ever after, stay with me. Because what happens next is the part almost nobody expects. Ford wasted no time getting the Cammer into competition cars. It was slotted into the Ford Galaxy for NASCAR's biggest ovals, the same tracks where aerodynamics and raw horsepower mattered most. Places like Daytona and Atlanta and Charlotte, where straight line speed on the long straightaways could make or break a race. Early testing was electric. Drivers who got behind the wheel of Cammer-powered cars came back talking about a level of raw power that genuinely surprised veteran racers who had already driven the best equipment Detroit could offer. Word spread through the garage areas fast. Ford had built something that could not just compete with the Hemi. It could potentially embarrass it the same way the Hemi had embarrassed Ford's regular engines just months earlier. For a brief moment, it looked like Ford was about to flip the entire balance of power in NASCAR on its head and do it with an engine so far ahead of the rulebook that nobody quite knew how to respond to it. And that is exactly the problem. NASCAR's leadership looked at what Ford had built, and they looked at what it would mean if this engine was allowed to race unrestricted. And they panicked. Two manufacturers showing up with engines this radical, this powerful, and this expensive to develop was not a healthy competitive landscape in NASCAR's eyes. It was an arms race that threatened to spiral out of control. Push costs to levels that could drive smaller teams out of the sport entirely, and turn NASCAR racing into a laboratory experiment for automakers rather than a stock car series rooted in cars that ordinary people could actually buy. NASCAR's rulebook required that engines be available in genuine production vehicles that regular customers could purchase. The homologation principle that was supposed to keep stock car racing connected to actual stock cars. Chrysler's Hemi barely cleared that bar. Ford's Cammer, brand new, exotic, and produced in tiny number, cleared it even less convincingly. NASCAR's officials made a decision that would define this engine's entire legacy before it ever competed in a points-paying race at the highest level. They imposed such severe weight penalties and displacement restrictions on the Cammer that running it competitively became almost pointless. In effect, without ever officially using the word ban, NASCAR made sure the engine that scared them the most would never get the chance to prove exactly how dominant it really was. There is a version of this story where you might assume NASCAR simply issued a clean, official ban, a single decision on a single day, and that would almost be easier to accept. But that is not quite what happened. And the reality is messier and, honestly, more frustrating. NASCAR never stood up and said the words, "The Cammer is banned." Instead, they buried it under a mountain of technical restrictions, weight penalties calculated in a way that conveniently erased the engine's power advantage, and homologation requirements that Ford could not realistically satisfy fast enough given how few complete vehicles existed with the engine installed. It was death by 1,000 rule changes rather than one clean decision, and in some ways that made it worse, because it meant Ford's engineers never got a single, official, final answer. They just watched their engine get quietly strangled by paperwork. Think about what that actually means for a moment, because it is one of the strangest outcomes in American motorsport history. Ford's engineers had done everything asked of them. They had been told to build an engine that could beat the best Chrysler had. And they had succeeded so completely that the very organization the engine was designed to compete in effectively refused to let it compete on equal terms. The Cammer was not defeated on the racetrack. It was neutralized before it got the chance to race at all. Ford had built a genuine masterpiece of American engineering, and the reward for that achievement was to have the sport itself close the door before the engine could walk through it. So what happened to an engine this powerful if NASCAR would not let it race? Ford did something that, in hindsight, turned out to create one of the most legendary chapters in drag racing history. Unable to fully unleash the camera on NASCAR ovals, Ford started selling the engine over the counter to drag racers, and this is where the camera's reputation truly exploded. Dropped into lightweight Ford drag cars stripped of anything unnecessary, the Cammer turned into an absolute terror on the quarter mile. Match race promoters loved booking Cammer-powered Fords because crowds would show up specifically to see this engine run. It became a fixture of match racing and funny car competition through the mid to late 1960s, where the rulebook restrictions that strangled it in NASCAR simply did not apply in the same way. On the drag strip, away from NASCAR's politics, the Cammer finally got to show exactly what it was capable of, and it did not disappoint. Picture a Friday night at a regional drag strip somewhere in the American Midwest in 1966. The announcer is hyping up the next pairing, and the crowd noise actually shifts in tone the moment they hear the word Cammer over the loudspeaker, because word had already spread through the racing community about exactly what this engine could do. When that car left the line, the sound alone was different from everything else running that night. A higher, sharper scream that came from an engine that was designed to rev in a way nothing else on the strip could match. Spectators who were there in period have described it as the loudest, angriest sounding engine most of them had ever heard in person, and the elapsed times backed up every bit of that reputation. Elapsed times and trap speeds from camera-powered cars during this era are still talked about by drag racing historians today, because this engine, built originally to dominate stock car ovals, ended up becoming a foundational piece of American drag racing folklore instead. But here's the part of this story that stings the most if you actually care about engineering and about fairness in competition. Ford never got the chance to prove, in a genuinely equal fight at NASCAR's highest level, whether the Cammer really was the superior engine. It appeared to be on paper and on the dyno. The weight penalties made it uncompetitive on the ovals it was designed for. Production numbers stayed extremely low because there was limited point in mass, producing an engine that could not race where it mattered most to Ford's marketing department. Ford quietly moved on, eventually developing other performance solutions for NASCAR, and the Cammer slipped into a strange kind of automotive purgatory, too powerful to be allowed a fair fight, too expensive and exotic to become a mainstream product, remembered by history as one of the greatest engines Detroit ever built and one of the least fairly treated. Today, an original Ford 427 SOHC Cammer engine, correctly documented and verified, is one of the most sought-after pieces of hardware in the entire collector car world. These engines were never installed in huge numbers to begin with, and decades of racing, engine swaps, and general attrition have made surviving, unmolested numbers, matching examples extraordinarily rare. Collectors and Ford FE engine specialists actively hunt for genuine Cammer blocks and complete engines, and when one surfaces with solid provenance, it can command prices that shock people unfamiliar with just how significant this engine was. A verified original Cammer, complete and correctly documented, can trade for well into six figures on its own, separate from any car it might be installed in. Complete Ford vehicles from this era that still carry their factory original Cammer engine, with matching numbers and documented history, are treated as blue-chip pieces of American automotive history, and they draw serious attention whenever one comes up for public sale. The rarity is not manufactured nostalgia. It is the direct result of an engine that was built in small numbers for a very specific and very short window of relevance. And here is something that surprises even people who think they already know this story well. Because the Cammer was sold over the counter rather than only installed at the factory. Tracking a specific engine's history back to a genuine period-correct build is often harder than tracing a normal factory-installed engine, which means the market for these engines is full of both incredible verified survivors and, unfortunately, a fair number of engines with murky or entirely fabricated histories. Genuine experts in this space can spot the difference through casting numbers, forging marks, and date codes that are almost impossible to fake convincingly. But it means the stakes for getting a professional opinion before spending real money are higher with this engine than with almost anything else from the era. If you're the kind of enthusiast who dreams about tracking one of these down, there are a few things worth knowing before you go looking. Verifying authenticity is the single most important step, because the Cammer's legendary reputation has, over the decades, made it a target for fraudulent claims and incorrect documentation. Genuine engines need to be traced through casting numbers, date codes, and documented history that connects them to verified production. Parts availability for the unique overhead cam components. The timing chain assembly, the cam drive mechanism, is far more limited than for a conventional FE engine, because these components were never shared with regular production Ford engines in any meaningful volume. Specialist FE engine communities and dedicated camera forums exist specifically because keeping one of these engines correctly running requires knowledge that most general classic car mechanics simply do not have. Getting connected with people who genuinely understand this engine before you ever buy one will save you years of frustration and a significant amount of money. The story of the Camry teaches a handful of lessons that Detroit had to learn more than once across the following decades. The first lesson is about the limits of pure engineering excellence inside a business and a sport that answers to more than just performance numbers. Ford's engineers solved the problem they were given completely and brilliantly, and it still was not enough, because racing series exist within political and financial ecosystems, not vacuum-sealed laboratories where the fastest engine always gets to prove it. The second lesson is about what happens to genuinely superior technology when the door closes on its intended purpose. The Camry did not disappear. It found a different stage entirely, drag racing, where it became arguably more legendary than it ever would have been, as just another engine option in a NASCAR points race. Sometimes the path a great piece of engineering takes to become a legend is not the path anyone originally planned for it. The third lesson connects directly to how Ford approached performance in the years that followed. The Camry's overhead cam philosophy, its willingness to break completely from conventional pushrod thinking, echoed forward into later high-performance Ford engineering, and the underlying lesson that sometimes the boldest engineering solution creates problems bigger than the one it was meant to solve stayed with Ford's performance division for years afterward. There is something genuinely poetic about how this story ends. If you sit with it for a moment, Ford set out to build the engine that would humiliate Chrysler's Hemi the way the Hemi had humiliated Ford at Daytona, and by every technical measure that matters, horsepower, valve control, high RPM capability, they succeeded arguably more completely than anyone at Ford originally expected them to. But being right, being genuinely measurably superior, was not enough to guarantee the Camry the stage it deserved. Politics closed the door that engineering had opened, and yet here we are, more than 60 years later, still talking about this engine, still hunting for surviving examples, still telling the story of the 600 horsepower monster that Ford built and then had to quietly bury before it ever got its fair shot. That is not the story of a failure. That is the story of an engine so far ahead of its time that the world it was built for was not ready to let it run free. If this story pulled you in, do not scroll past without hitting the like button, because it genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive into the machines and the moments that automotive history almost forgot. Drop a comment and tell me if you think NASCAR made the right call banning this engine, or if you think Ford deserved the chance to prove it on the track exactly the way they built it to compete. Share this with anyone you know who loves engines, horsepower, and the stories Detroit does not talk about enough. One last thought before you go. The Ford Camry is proof that being the best is not always the same thing as being allowed to win. Ford built the engine they were asked to build. They built it better than anyone expected, better in some ways than the engine that had inspired it in the first place. And the reward for that achievement was to have the very competition it was built for decide it could not be allowed to compete fairly. Every collector who tracks down a genuine Camry today, every engine builder who keeps one of these rare units running, every enthusiast who tells this story around a garage or a car show is in some small way making the argument that this engine deserved better than what it got. 616 horsepower, built in 1964, banned before it ever got the fair fight it earned. Ford built a monster. The sport it was built for buried it, and more than half a century later, it is still one of the greatest engines nobody ever really got to see run free.